What is up, Ewu crew? Today, we are going to be covering a case so captivating, it will leave you wondering who in the world, if anyone, you can trust. If you enjoy true crime, mysteries, and true stories, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. Now, let's get into it. Rafi and David met while they were in college together, and despite their extremely different career interests, they hit it off and quickly became best friends. Rafi had his sights on journalism post-graduation, whereas David became a traffic policy analyst. But the two men had one distinct interest in common that brought them together. They had both always dreamed of traveling. So, in July of 1999, David invited Rafi to come along with him on a cross-country adventure before he officially moved to California for his master's program. The plan was for the trip to end with David and Rafi arriving at David's family's house for farewell festivities, if they made it that far. Around 6 days into their journey from Massachusetts to California, David and Rafi pulled over alongside Carlsbad Caverns National Park in southern New Mexico. That particular section of the Chihuahuan Desert in the summer months was noticeably hotter than any other time of the year. Yet David and Rafi were rather interested in checking it out while they were in the area. In all honesty, most of their interest in traversing the area was actually due in part to the notion that they were both extremely road-weary and nearly out of funds for the remainder of their trip. So, the two men came up with a sleeping solution that would prove to save them some extra money: camping in the sun-blazed section of the national park. Upon pulling into the entrance of the national park, David asked the nearest park ranger where he and his best friend would be able to camp overnight for free. The ranger offhandedly recommended that David and Rafi consider staying in Rattlesnake Canyon. Intrigued by the idea of an adventurous challenge, the two men thanked the park ranger and headed in the direction of the Rattlesnake Canyon's trailhead. David and Rafi obtained and filled out a camping permit for a single night, purchased 3 pints of water and a topographical map at the Carlsbad Caverns National Park's gift shop, and headed down to the canyon floor in hopes to pitch their tent before nightfall. By the time the pair made it to the very bottom of the canyon, the sun had already started to set. As quickly as they could manage, they set up a makeshift camp consisting of a quaint tent, a commandeered fire pit, and suboptimal sleeping conditions. As the Carlsbad Park Ranger had recommended that the men carry 1 gallon of water per person per day, David purchased 3 gallons to appropriately cover himself and Rafi over the course of their night-long stay. Perhaps the two men should have planned a bit better, and perhaps, if they had been more prepared, they could have avoided what would come. Considering the notion that they intended to only stay in the canyon for one singular evening, Rafi and David saw no issue in utilizing one of their 3 gallons of water to boil hot dogs for their dinner after they finished making camp. After all, they would be in and out of the canyon by the time the sun rose in the morning. Except, life does not always go as planned. When David and Rafi woke early in the morning of August 4th, 1999, they were entirely unaware of what would be in store for them. Rafi helped David break camp and pack up all of their belongings before setting out into the direction of the parking lot, where they had left their car in the night before. Unfortunately, neither David nor Rafi actually knew how to properly read a topographic map, let alone the one they had purchased at the national park's gift shop. So, when they couldn't agree on which direction they had come from the day before, David and Rafi realized all too suddenly that they were lost. After much deliberation, the men decided to pick a direction at random and set off on foot in search of any other people, or hopefully their own vehicle. On their walk in the blazing sun, David and Rafi learned all too well just how painful summer heat could actually be, especially when food and water were remarkably scarce. In fact, by midday, both men had polished off their respective gallons of water, which had already been half empty from the night before. With no food, no water, and no sense of direction, the grim reality of the situation had truly started to set in for the two weary travelers. They were stuck in the canyon for another night. So, weakened and exhausted, David and Rafi found themselves once again pitching their tent and setting up their even more limited campsite for yet another night of sleeping at the bottom of Rattlesnake Canyon. Sleep ended up as a brief source of relief for the men, as they were less affected by the heat. However, the following morning brought both David and Rafi crashing back to reality. When the two men rose once more, they were incredibly disheveled and felt completely down on their luck. Their poor morale levels, combined with their lack of sustenance, led the pair to make bad decisions. More specifically, bad decisions that involved leaving their new campsite and hiking across the canyon floor even farther than they had the day before. In fact, David and Rafi ended up walking all the way across the canyon and ultimately climbed all the way to the top of the opposite rim from where they had originally entered, all in 100-degree heat. The two men had actually decided to head in that particular direction, as Rafi had claimed to have seen moving lights in the distance the night before, lights that both men prayed to be headlights. Where there were headlights, the men hoped, there would be road. That road would make all of their trekking worth it. Unfortunately, for David and Rafi, there was no road. Upon learning that their efforts throughout the day were all for nothing, both of the men had felt completely dejected, dehydrated, and ultimately panicky. The sun over their heads beat down on them relentlessly as they considered their limited options. Finally, David suggested that they take cover under the shade of a nearby bush. There, the two men found themselves sweating out the last bits of precious water that remained in their systems as they watched a group of vultures circle them just overhead. Later that night, Rafi wrote in his journal, quote, "We will not let the buzzards get us alive." And he was determined to keep that promise. As the afternoon dragged on, David suggested that they start to trek back to their camp from the night before. The two fought through their exhaustion and dehydration once more and hiked back towards where they had set out from in the morning. On their walk back to camp, their excessive hunger and thirst started to get the best of the two men, leading both of them to eat cactus fruit, desperate for the juice the desert plants give off. The liquid that the cactus fruit gave off was, unfortunately, extremely limited and did not do much to quench their thirst. At that point, David and Rafi's bodies were starting to feel the consequences of such extreme dehydration, leading them to do something neither of them ever thought they would do: consume their own urine. Unfortunately, neither of the men fully understood the mechanics of such a feat, nor did they realize that one's body actually uses up more water when trying to process the waste within the urine than it would gain from drinking the liquid. When Rafi attempted to drink his urine, he ended up gagging and ultimately deciding he could not actually go through with it. David, on the other hand, was desperate enough to drink as much as possible, in the hopes that it would help his body function better than it had been throughout the day. Throughout the night, while Rafi tried to sleep, David realized the consequences of his actions. He began vomiting uncontrollably. In fact, David suffered from an extremely restless stomach all night long. By the time morning rolled around, David was in a state of distress. He couldn't keep any of the cactus fruit down, and his body was suffering extensively from 3 days' worth of dehydration. He had effectively lost all hope that he and Rafi would ever make it out of Rattlesnake Canyon alive. In fact, David had actually come to terms with his own fate. According to Rafi, David turned to him and in his fit of agony around 5 or 6 in the morning, looked him in the eye and asked him to do the unthinkable. David begged Rafi to put him out of his misery. Rafi allegedly declined at first, as he could not bear the idea of ending his best friend's life. However, Rafi claims to have made an agreement with David upon listening to his alleged pleas for relief. The purported deal went as follows. Rafi would end David's life first, and then take his own life shortly after. According to Rafi, David looked him in the eyes once more and begged for Rafi to bury his pocket knife into his chest. So, Rafi did. And when David did not die right away, Rafi stabbed him in the chest once more, this time in the heart, until he finally watched the life fade from his best friend's eyes. When Rafi was positive that David was dead, he found that he was entirely incapable of simply leaving David's lifeless body out in the canyon floor in such a merciless manner. So, he made an effort to dig a shallow grave for his friend and bury him to the best of his ability. In fact, despite his own apparent exhaustion, Rafi actually gathered a variety of large rocks to cover David with, some weighing more than 70 pounds. Just like that, Rafi killed his best friend. Rafi claims that he intended to keep up with his end of the mercy deal he had made with David, though he ended up growing remarkably weak during the process of burying his friend. As a result, Rafi ended up partially collapsing in the desert sun near the bush where he and David had spent the night just hours before. Figuring he would potentially die soon from exhaustion, thirst, or hunger, Rafi sat and waited for death to take him too. And then he heard someone calling for him. Rafi looked up into the distance, where he saw something he assumed he would never see. Someone coming to his rescue. A park ranger approached the disoriented Rafi with caution, letting him know that he had been out searching for Rafi and David since the two men didn't show up at their car after their camping permit expired. As the park ranger, Lance Matson, got closer to where Rafi sat in the dirt, he realized something must have been very, very wrong. Rafi was alone. Lance kept his distance from Rafi and calmly asked him where his friend was. Rafi looked away before he responded to Lance with one simple answer. "I killed him." He then pointed to the pile of rocks just feet away from the bush, indicating that David was buried somewhere under it. An entry from Rafi's journal from that same morning contained a statement that said, quote, "I killed and buried my best friend today. David had been in pain all night, and around 5 or 6, he turned to me and begged that I put my knife through his chest. I did. And a second time, when he wouldn't die." New Mexico police arrived shortly after the park ranger came across the crime scene. When officers learned of the events of the past 3 days, they could hardly believe what had happened. More so than that, no one actually knew what to believe. 2 men had gone into Rattlesnake Canyon, and only one of them had come out. The truth of what really happened to David could have been properly told by Rafi, or it could have been buried with him in the desert heat. Sheriff Mark Anthony Click had been one of the first officials on the scene and quickly learned of the events of the evening from Rafi's claims. Sheriff Click was one of the first individuals to express his disbelief regarding what Rafi claimed to be the truth. Sheriff Click stated blatantly, quote, "I don't care what anyone says, people just don't do that to their friends. You don't get to kill someone in the state of New Mexico just because they ask you to. The actual investigation into David's death was adamantly short, as there was no mystery into who had killed him, nor how he was killed. The main question that everyone was concerned with was, why had Rafi really stabbed his best friend to death? An autopsy on David's body made it clear to investigators that his vomiting from the morning he had died was more due to the fact that he had ingested his own urine and eaten unripe cactus fruit, and was not actually an indication of the end stage of death by thirst. Additionally, it became incredibly evident to investigators that David and Rafi were dehydrated. But they had not been anywhere near actual death. In fact, many other individuals in similar positions had survived without food and water in such hot conditions for far longer than the two men had been stranded. Officials began to wonder if Rafi and David had started to dramatize their situation by comparing it to any stereotypical Hollywood Western film. After all, the two men were lost without any food or water in the middle of a desert for a few days. It could have easily felt like an old age story with a seemingly predictable ending: death. Rafi's remarks regarding the situation were centered around his claim that he had killed David out of consideration for his friend. Rafi even ventured to state, quote, "What I thought I was doing was keeping my friend from going through 12 to 24 hours of hell before he died." Rafi was, of course, arrested for the murder of David Coughlin. At his trial, Rafi ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder, though he maintained a notion that he had truly only killed David out of mercy. Prosecutors at the trial showed the courtroom video footage of officials removing the rocks from David's makeshift gravesite and revealing David's body and blood-soaked t-shirt. Park officials even testified at the trial, noting that David and Rafi had only actually been about 30 minutes away on foot from their car when Rafi had killed David. Prosecution also alleged to the court that the young journalist may have been influenced by a fevered imagination. Part of this argument was the fact that in his position as an editorial assistant to the Boston Globe newspaper, Rafi had reportedly written a 2-part novel story about getting lost in the desert. Though the connection between fiction and the later grim reality is tenuous, it was alleged in court that Rafi's vivid imagination could have played a role in his belief that the situation was worse than it actually was. When the defense took the stand, they were adamant on asserting that the Carlsbad Cavern National Park had been at fault. In part, as their maps were not sufficient enough for 2 adult men to utilize in a moment of distress. Furthermore, medical experts testified that such heat conditions as the ones that David and Rafi had been exposed to have been known to cause heat-related panic that could, in turn, result in poor decision-making. On May 10, 2000, Rafi was sentenced to 15 years in prison. But the Chief District Judge, J.W. Forbes, ended up suspending 13 years of Rafi's 15-year sentence as probation, meaning that Rafi would ultimately only serve 2 years for David's murder. At the sentencing, Rafi said, "This is something I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. This isn't a 2-year sentence for me. This is a life sentence." David's own family were not fully present at Rafi's trial, though they ended up faxing a statement over to the prosecutor at the trial that read, quote, "We can think of no reason why Rafi would have wished David any harm or pain. Moreover, we cannot presume to know what transpired, or the thoughts and emotions the two experienced during the days before David's death. To be sure, we have questions. However, we find it difficult to believe there was any malicious intent." To this day, David's death remains a mystery. Perhaps Rafi had told the truth about the situation, or perhaps the truth is truly buried with David Coughlin. As the only other person who could possibly know for certain what had happened never made it out of Rattlesnake Canyon, the world may never know what actually happened on that fateful morning in August 1999. So what do you think happened to David Coughlin? Do you think Rafi is telling the truth and it was a mercy killing? Or do you think that David's death was far more sinister than Rafi had let on? Let us know in the comments below.